Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Savannah Tryens-Fernandes if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Tuesday, March the 29th, and today I am joined by our Alabama Education Lab reporter, Savannah Tryens-Fernandes. Savannah is here today to talk about a report she published this morning about some of the possible fallout from some legislation that's happening right now in Alabama regarding kids and kids who identify as transgender or who have a type of gender dysphoria. So we're going to get into all of that. Savannah's going to kind of break down some of the fears that Alabama parents and advocates have of if this legislation goes into law, the kind of effects it could have on their kids, particularly their kids in public schools in Alabama. So Savannah, there's a lot to unpack here. I know we're just going to get into it, but I think the thing to first talk about is exactly what this legislation does. Now, I'm going to look at the name here so I get the full name and do not mess it up. It is the Alabama Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act. That's also referred to as HB 266 in the House and SB 184 in the Senate, if anybody wants to look it up. But essentially what that legislation does, it's similar to the ones we've been talking about for the past several years in the Alabama legislature. And essentially what it does is it penalizes gender-affirming medical treatment for minors. What else can you tell us about this legislation?
Yeah, so what you said, it penalizes those treatments so anyone who would administer them or prescribe them. And in Alabama, that's really just puberty blockers because minors under the age of 19, can't get the cosmetic surgery to change their body. But puberty blockers, anyone who administers or prescribes them would get up to 10 years in prison or $15,000 fine. And what the legislation also does is it would require teachers, school nurses, school counselors, really administrators, anyone in the school environment to share with a parent or a guardian if a child is questioning their gender. Any information related to that, they would be required to tell a parent or guardian.
There's a lot of sides to this, right? There's a lot of things to unpack out of what you just said. But I think let's start with, again, you mentioned that essentially what this legislation would do is block children from receiving puberty blockers, because we know that gender affirming surgery is not usually performed on minors in Alabama, anybody under the age of 19. So let's focus on the puberty blockers part of that. Not only do parents and advocates say that this legislation could get their kids essentially to have to stop their current treatments that they have maybe been on for several years at this point. Not only that, but parents and advocates say that this legislation could out their kids in school, as you just mentioned, saying that counselors or teachers or educators would be required to report back to parents or to guardians to say, look, your child is questioning their gender identity. There's a lot to talk about here, but you did talk with some school counselors about kind of that aspect of this legislation. So tell me what you found from those school counselors.
Yeah, there's a concern that this is going to put a wedge between the relationship that they've been building with students, all of these years, and their role as school counselors. And first, we've heard from the president-elect of the Alabama School Counselor Association that said, this is going to breach confidentiality. This is going to change the nature of their role, where anytime a student sits down with them now, they're going to have to say, hey, by the way, before you say anything to me, I'm required to report this. So please keep that in mind. So there's a real concern that this is going to take away the safe space in schools that they've been trying to build. And, it's going to be one less space that LGBTQ students in Alabama have.
Well, and two, you quoted a school counselor and people who work in that industry in your article, and they said that, look, we've been trying to build up this trust for years with kids to say, if you need to talk about this, you can come to me. Even if you do not have a supportive person at home to talk with, you can talk with us. That is our job. We are counselors. We are here for you. We're here to support you. And now we've got people in that industry who are saying, look, this legislation kind of is the opposite of what we're supposed to do as school counselors. Again, as you said, kind of having to say to the kid, look, whatever you tell me, I'm going to have to go tell your parents. Yeah. Then you would presumably think a kid's not going to say that, because if they don't want it to get back to their parents, they're going to think that through. So tell me a little bit about what you learned from people who are in the counseling industry about kind of that oxymoron there.
Yeah. So basically, they are worried that they're not going to have, students have come to them traditionally and said, this is how I'm feeling. Can you maybe help me in a way that I can come out to my parents, help me and find a way to feel safe in school, help me to share who I am to my friends, my family, whoever it may be. And now there's this requirement that, hey, if this happens, we will have to tell you. I'm sorry, I just keep having someone knock on my door. If you could just give me 1 second.
You are good. I'm going to remove Savannah here there while she makes sure that somebody does not have an issue at her door. I'll add her back here in just a minute. But essentially what we're doing is we're talking about this legislation in the Alabama Senate and in the House, and that is called the Alabama Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act, which essentially criminalizes people who give gender affirming healthcare to minors in Alabama. And then that's, again, anybody under the age of 19. Okay, we've got Savannah back here, so I'll give it back to you.
Sorry. Yes. So it would basically build that wedge between counselors and students. And there's just a real concern that where are students going to turn? Should they not have the option to turn to counselors? Should they not have the option to turn to their families? And what position will that put them in? Will it silence them even more? Will it make them feel a little bit more isolated, build on the anxieties, the depressions they may already have? So yeah, there's just a concern across the board from a lot of the counselors, mental health coordinators I've spoken with, and concern that families as well, who say, why should we isolate our children even more?
Well, and there's also an argument that Alabama does not have a lot of households maybe who are supportive of their child if they came to them and saying that they're questioning their gender identity. You have some statistics here, but you had talked with somebody from the Magic City Acceptance Center, which deals with a lot of LGBTQ plus kids and teenagers, and they said, look, these kids might not have anywhere to turn but their school counselors. Now, if you're taking away that option, then they genuinely don't have anybody to talk to about this. It is not going to go run and tell their parents if that's not their situation. Now, take that kind of on the flip side. We have kids who can talk with their parents, who are supportive, the parents who are supportive of their positions. You actually talked with the family in this story about that. And those parents say, look, we're on our kids' side. We want our kid to be receiving these puberty blockers or whatever that might be. And in this specific family you mentioned, their daughter has been taking these medications for several years now. And they say that, look, under this new legislation, if that becomes law, our daughter might not have access to medication that she's been on now for 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what do you do in that situation? And for that family, their only alternative option at this point seems to be to leave the state of Alabama. And is that really, the only option that we can present, not have access to care or to leave the state altogether? But, that can be an option for people who have supportive families. But on the flip side, for people who don't have supportive families, who, don't have access to this care and are now just looking for a place to feel safe, people to open up to, having the threat of being outed by educators, being outed by people who have previously given you a safe space can really do a lot of harm in terms of, being rejected by your family, being kicked out of your house. We know that LGBTQ youth face an increased likelihood of being homeless than their peers do, being part of the juvenile justice system than their peers do. So there's just a lot of factors here that we have to consider.
Well, and two, I've got a comment here from somebody who says they are the parent of a trans teen. She says, I fully support him, and I'm so grateful to the Gender Clinic at Children's of Alabama. They've been so educational and helpful to our son and to us. And Trace, that we've heard of several other families like yourself that are dealing with the same types of things. And it's interesting because you mentioned that you are fully supportive of your son, and your son is lucky to have a supportive family. A lot of the trans community does not have that type of support. Savannah, and you mentioned that is why these school counselors are so vital. Now, something that I want to kind of go back to is we talked about this Magic City Acceptance Center. You spoke with some leaders at the Magic City Acceptance Center, and I thought this was very interesting. You noted in your story that center offers training to schools statewide to help educators and administrators get kind of a basic understanding of what gender expression, gender identity is, gender dysphoria is, and kind of give the 101 class, right? So they've had this training, and this was very interesting to me. Only 4 schools have taken that training in the last 5 years, and that is out of many schools in the state of Alabama. I'm sure you have a much better number than I do in mind, but out of all the schools, only 4 have gotten that training. Savannah, why?
Yeah. So as Amanda said to me and was quoted in the story, there's just been a rejection of this information, pretty wholesale, from schools and administrators in Alabama. She said that what they've heard were they don't believe that they have LGBTQ students in their schools, that it's very controversial. She told me about a story about how they would have, plans to go to these schools. And then the morning of, they'd get a phone call from an administrator saying, parents heard that we were doing this. We can't do it anymore. It's just too controversial. So there's just such a stigma attached, I think, to any, trainings, resources, knowledge about LGBTQ students, youth, and, the resources that they would need, that there's just kind of been a rejection across the board of services that could be provided to them. But we do know that the Magic City Acceptance Center has now, given that schools as a whole and administrations are very hesitant to participate, they are now doing open educator training. So, even if your school doesn't want it, you as an individual teacher or, member of support staff or nurse or counselor can come in and get these trainings for yourself. And those have been much better attended than the school trainings.
That's interesting, especially when we look at our kids, and most of our kids are going to spend more time with their teachers, with their counselors and their educators than they do with their parents, just based on numbers, the amount of time that they are in school versus the time they're at home. Those are the people that you would think would be wanting to get that training, would be interested in that training. Now, we've got some really good questions coming in, so I'm going to throw these out to you, Savannah. So the same parent that we had a minute ago talking about their son who was trans, she says, I'm also a social worker. Am I going to have to make a mandatory report on myself if this bill passes and becomes law? And I think that's an interesting question there, an interesting point.
Yeah, so there is a stipulation in the law that says, mental health professionals who have a master's level psychology, social work degree or higher can still perform, the professional services they provide to LGBTQ youth. So this does not impact them, and that would not impact social workers, to my knowledge.
Got it. Hopefully that answers your question, Trey. So we'll be covering this as well when this comes back up in the legislature and what we're expecting to be the next few weeks as well. Another question here from Brian. Brian says, under this possible law, could school counselors legally refer kids to other resources like the Magic City Acceptance Center?
That's a good question. So the law says that you cannot withhold information, but it also says you cannot encourage students in any way to have these beliefs about themselves. So would, referring resources be seen as encouragement? We don't know, because the language is just so vague. But I will say there is not an enforcement mechanism given for teachers, counselors, school personnel. So it's not if you withhold information or if you encourage in some way that this will happen to you.
And that's one of those things that sounds like it's a little muddy right now with this legislation. Hopefully we will learn more about that again when this bill comes back up in session. Now, this is more of a comment than a question, but we have somebody saying, look, shouldn't this be a topic that's taught at home and discussed at home? So we should make clear that this is not about teaching. This is not about a curriculum necessarily. Mm-hmm. This legislation is something that, again, would penalize people who are giving their child, for doctors who are prescribing minors in Alabama puberty blockers or other gender affirming treatment. So this is not necessarily about, this is not the Florida legislation that we've talked about. This is not necessarily about a course in schools. So just to make that clear here. Now, again, let's talk quickly about the flip side of this, Savannah. The people who have introduced this legislation and the sponsors say that it, quote, protects children by preventing minors from making decisions that would permanently alter their bodies. They also called the bill, or says the bill prevents child abuse during a February legislative hearing. Mm-hmm. That's one side of the coin. Yeah. The other side of the coin, again, is you have parents that say what could be child abuse would be taking away medication from my child who has been on this medication for several years. So, Savannah, I know that you've covered this and you've been at the legislature and you've heard some of the discussion here between the legislators. How has this conversation gone?
Yeah, so it's been very split along partisan lines. A lot of support from the Republican side, and the legislators that are sponsoring this bill are 100% Republicans. So there's just been a big political divide on this bill. The House bill was went through the Judiciary Committee. And so that committee said, why are we the ones seeing this? This should be in the Health Committee, but it still passed that committee. So I think it's a lot of, we're going to hear from the public. We're going to see what they have to say. But so far, this has just moved forward along party lines.
That's, I guess it's something that probably a lot of our viewers and a lot of readers of your article probably not find surprising there. Now, again, when we are looking through some of these comments, just to kind of reiterate, the counselors, the reason we're talking about school counselors is not because of offering a course or not because of teaching kids in school. I think the kind of scenario that you would imagine here would be that a child or a teenager knocks on their counselor's door or walks into their counselor's cubicle, however that is set up, and says, look, I'm having some gender issues. I'm not relating with the gender that I was assigned at birth or vice versa. And that counselor then cannot offer the type of counseling that they might have been trained to give or that they might have given previously. Is that kind of a fair explanation, Savannah?
Yeah, I would say so. And also this, applies to teachers, school nurses, administrators as well. So you can imagine a teacher in an environment where even if they heard a student talking to a peer, technically that would fall under any information related to a student questioning their gender identity.
Well, and another thing I wanted to make clear as well is we talked a little bit about the Magic City Acceptance Center. Now, that is different from the Magic City Acceptance Academy. So the Acceptance Center is kind of a resource center. And then the Acceptance Academy is an LGBTQ, affirming public charter school that has recently opened. Can you tell us a little bit about both of those things and what the differences are?
Sure. So the Acceptance Center is, a resource center, an inclusive space where LGBTQ youth can go and find resources, find people to talk to, kind of just exist and feel safe in that space for the period of time where they're there. There are events they put on, there are different trainings they give. So it's a very comprehensive type of service they provide. The Magic City Acceptance Academy is a school for 6th through 12th graders right outside of Birmingham that opened this year. And, it's your average public school, but it really focuses on being an affirming space for LGBTQ students. A lot of the staff members are LGBTQ, a lot of the students are LGBTQ. They teach the history of, Stonewall. Their curriculum makes sure that students see themselves in society. So very different, very close in proximity to each other, both in the Birmingham area, but both resources that try and give LGBTQ Alabamians a place to feel safe.
Well, and actually, the principal of the Magic City Acceptance Academy has said that they have seen quite a few people and quite a few kids trying to transfer into their school since this legislation has come up, saying that they need a safe space. Is that right? Can you tell us more about that?
Well, they've seen the transfer happen since the beginning of the school year. And since this legislation has come up, they've seen in their students just this increased anxiety, this increased fear about what this could mean for them. But they've had hundreds of students transfer between the grades of 6 through 12 in this school year, and they've had rolling, admissions as the school year has gone on. And, as the principal said, a lot of these students are bringing with them the issues from their past school systems, kind of the discrimination they faced, the bullying they faced, and the mental health issues that arise from that. And at this Magic City Acceptance Center, Acceptance Academy, they're trying to, give them a space where that's no longer the case for them.
There's an interesting, this is not necessarily a question, but interesting comment here. And I think that it's worth pointing out about a situation involving those school counselors. This person says if a kid or a teenager, and I'm saying kind of kid interchangeably there, goes to their school counselor and says, my parents are beating me, then that school counselor does not have to go back and tell the parents, hey, your kid said that you're being beat. But if they say that they are feeling some types of thoughts or experiencing feelings about their gender, then the counselor would be required, to report back to the parents about that. That's kind of an interesting look at that.
Yeah. So any, teachers would still have to report instances of child abuse to DHR, whereas this would make the person receiving the reports, the parent. So that is the difference. But, teachers and educators are still using mandatory reporter language that is taken from those instances of having to report child abuse and applying it to what they would be now required to do under this law. So there are differences, and reporting them to their parents is, what this law stipulates for whatever reason, and could actually do a lot of harm in, instances where parents aren't supportive of their child's gender identity. But yeah, differences there as to who they have to report to.
Question for you, Savannah. This is not necessarily something that you address in your story, but I think that it's something a lot of people would probably be wondering. This legislation, all of these conversations, these political arguments are being had by adults, right? Most of our lawmakers are older adults. It involves kids and teenagers. I think there is a lot of there's a lot of thought going around that kids and teenagers are so much different than even when we were growing up, and especially when our lawmakers were growing up, and especially when our lawmakers were in school. And that thought is that kids and teenagers are more accepting of gender fluidity, gender affirming, again, treatment, just questioning their gender in general. Kids are more open to that. Teenagers are more open to that, whether or not maybe they're questioning their identity. They are not as maybe confused by that, or they don't see that as much of a surprise as some of our older lawmakers, or even, again, when we were growing up in school. Have you seen that to be the case when you've gone into schools, when you've talked with teenagers, you've talked with kids? Did they have that same feeling of their lawmakers of thinking that that this is something that should be talked about, this is something that should be regulated, or are they kind of more open?
Well, I think that the kids that this affect, definitely think this is not a place of a lawmaker to be telling me who I am, how I identify, and how I should then, move about the world and what treatments are best for me. There is still a lot of stigma, I think, in schools. So it's not just that teenagers and young people are universally accepting. I think that young people and teenagers in Alabama still face a lot of bullying, face a lot of harassment and discrimination in schools. And, laws like this just make them even more vulnerable to that. When you teach people that they can be excluded, they can be discriminated against. But I think that, there are a lot of young people that are willing to be allies, be supporters, rally around, their peers who are facing, these laws, who are going to be impacted by these laws. We saw in Florida when they passed the Don't Say Gay bills, high schools would do walkouts and, line up outside holding up posters that say, "We say gay." So I think there's this balance of support, but also the discrimination, bullying, harassment that we're going to see.
There's a lot to watch here, Savannah, as this legislation moves forward. What is next for this legislation? When are we going to know if it goes through? And kind of what's the deadline on that becoming law?
Yeah, so there's no scheduled hearings as of now in either the House or Senate for these laws. So we still have to wait and see when they're going to take up, the next hearing. But we're thinking it should be in the next 2 weeks or so, as this legislative session is slated to end.
A lot to keep up with here, Savannah. I know that you and the rest of our Alabama Education Lab is going to keep us updated here. You can find more information about this topic again on the Alabama Education Lab. We'll leave that link here as well, along with a link to Savannah's reporting that we've been talking about today. So again, Savannah, thank you so much for explaining this a little bit, kind of breaking it down, especially for those of us who might not have been paying as much attention to this issue as we are now. So again, Savannah, thank you. Everybody watching, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for having me.